it's not that people are looking to fill this existential emptiness as much as they're looking for an upgrade to what they're already experiencing that's good in their life. So maybe they're pursuing justice. Maybe they're pursuing creativity. Maybe they're pursuing intimacy and community. Maybe they're searching for ways to be more compassionate or to serve and be involved in helping other people. What it is it's the broken image of God inside of them, like a little mirror that's been busted up to pieces, and this little piece of mirror is still shining the glory of God in their life, and they're going, I like that. How do I make that bigger? And it's not so much that it's a vacuum, a hole, as much as it is space that wants to grow and be filled with this little shard of something that's there.
Well, hello, everyone. We are back for another episode on Up Next. And today I get a chance to talk with Mark Matlock over at Dallas, Texas. Mark, you've been with movement.org. You've worked with Urbana, all of that stuff. Mark, what is your new role these days?
These days, I am leading Urbana for InterVarsity. So that's my new assignment.
Mark, I love InterVarsity. I went to InterVarsity when I was at Washington University in St. Louis. Tom Lynn is a dear friend. Greg House started Resource Global. But for those who may not be familiar with Urbana, how would you describe what Urbana is?
Yeah, well, back in 1946, there was kind of a lull that had happened in terms of North American students being involved in world mission. And about 600 students gathered in Toronto, Canada, to consider three questions. What is God doing in the world right now? What is God's word saying to me? And what does God want me to do in response? And that gathering moved from Toronto to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana and became known as the Urbana Convention, where thousands of college students would gather to ask those three questions and respond to what God was doing in their lives. I went in 1990, and it changed the direction of my life. I told God I'd go anywhere, and 6 months later, I found myself in Dallas, Texas.
And Mark, Urbana is a special place in my heart just because I attended two Urbanas. One of them, I was on the Urbana leadership team. And if there was anything Urbana and just being there taught me the importance of the Global South. Mark, I was a guy who didn't really care. It was not on my radar. When we're sitting there talking about global missions, I said, oh, yeah, sure, it's not for me, so whatever. But then at the same time, when I understood the Global South, what it meant that the world was changing, all of that, it really allowed me to change my perspective. And here at Resource Global started because of my primary role with Urbana. I love it.
Well, it's so important because, while there is so much of kind of the West going into the world, thankfully that started to shift, and we see that the majority church is no longer in the West, it is in the Global South. And so that's left North Americans kind of asking the question, well, what does this look like for me now to be involved in Great Commission work now that, 97% of the unreached people groups are in the Global South, but the majority of the church is in the Global South. And so there's a lot of energy there. And North Americans are trying to figure out, exactly how God wants us to be a part of things. I don't think there's any vocation that's probably been more self-critical of itself than the mission movement in the world. And, a lot of mistakes made, a lot of things to lament. But at the same time, a lot of really wonderful things in how the gospel is spread, so that the churches continue to grow and thrive. And now we are taking our cues from our brothers and sisters in the Global South.
Yeah. Mark, I'm not sure. When I was younger, I still think in the late 80s, early 90s, I remember sitting in my church and sitting through a presentation that another church did on, Lord, please don't send me to Africa. And I always thought that global missions was, we send out Americans, we raise support, and everyone needs to know Jesus, and that's how it is. For you, when did that shift start taking place in your head, in your heart? What was it? Something you saw? Was it someone you talked with where you started saying, wow, the world has gotten smaller. We got to change our approach to how we look at missions.
Well, for me, when I was about 7 years old, my best friend, his parents went to go work in Indonesia to work with JARS, the Jungle Aviation and
Yep.
Radio Service, the support arm of Wycliffe Bible translators. And another young man in my church who I looked up to quite a bit, he later went on to serve as a Bible translator in Papua New Guinea. And as a very young boy, I was engaged in this work. And I think probably of all the different missionary efforts, those involved in Bible translation have really been some of the best leaders in contextualizing and understanding the gospel. The whole motivation around Bible translation is, to honor the culture, the language of the other people, and to contextualize the gospel message, the Bible, for those people, and to see them self-theologize and
Hmm.
lead as well as they receive that word. And so I think that really shaped me a lot as I was growing up. And I started seeing that, the things that I was wanting to be involved in missionally were starting to change as we started seeing that majority church building and shifting there in the global South. And, anytime the Bible is read, wherever it's read and used, that is where the source of theology and theological thought is going to come from. And I think we're seeing that today.
Yep. Hey, Mark, what did you do? What did you think that you were going to do when you were growing up as a young boy?
Well, so I was actually a magician when I was like in elementary school, and for the first few years of my adult life too, I was a professional magician.
Seriously?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I was a member of the Magic Castle in Beverly Hills, California. And but when and then I really got interested in filmmaking, and there's a lot of similarities between filmmaking and being a magician, because there's all about illusion and creating reality, right? And so I thought I would go and become a filmmaker. And when I went to Biola, I met a guy named Marvin Mayers, who's an anthropologist. And when I met him and spent some time with him, I thought, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to be an anthropologist. So my goal in college was to be an anthropological consultant for Wycliffe Bible translators. That's what I thought my calling was going to be in life, and
Wow.
what I was going to do. I never did that, but I had been involved in the Bible translation movement as a board member and other things like that with different agencies throughout my life.
Yeah, yeah. So what was your first official role in terms of ministry? What made you decide to switch over to ministry then, and was it with Barna?
Well, no, what's interesting is in 1990, I went to Urbana, and I literally did tell the, the Congress, I will go anywhere God wants me to go.
No.
And then 6 months later, I got invited to be a part of a conference for teenagers that was teaching the Bible to teenagers in the United States. And before I knew it, I got swept up in doing that work and bringing kind of the Great Commission, global perspectives around Christianity to younger people. And that became my calling. And I went on to lead an organization called Youth Specialties,
Yeah.
and focused most of my life on trying to reach the next generation. It's also at that time when I started working with Barna. I was actually working out of my office garage. We were doing a bunch of pioneering in the internet ministry space, which was something that was relatively new. And we were promoting and selling worship music out of my garage. And we were like the source for like Mercy Me, Chris Tomlin.
Yes.
We were the only ones online that could get you these people at the time. This is before they had their record deals and all of that. And I decided, we really don't know a lot about young people, what they're thinking. We should do some research on that. So I
Mhm.
called the Barna Group in Ventura, and I said, hey, I want to do this project studying teens and evangelism, but I don't just want to talk to teenagers that are Christians. I want to talk to teenagers that aren't Christians too, and see how much they connect with one another. And the person who called me back was a guy named David Kinnaman. And
Mm.
David had just graduated from Biola and started working for George. And David had gone to school with my brothers, so he recognized my name and called me back. I sat down and talked with George. George said, hey, it's really cute that you guys in your garage office want to do a national research project. I don't think you know how much that costs, because I'll tell you what, if you work with David instead of me, I'll do it at cost. And that
Okay.
began a 20 plus year relationship with David Kinnaman, doing research on the next generation. And so we started doing work on the millennials when they were teenagers, before they were called millennials. They hadn't even been given a name yet. And so that was where I began my work with Barna, and have done a number of projects with them ever
Yeah.
since. And David has become one of my closest friends.
Yeah. Mark, what has surprised you, even in terms as you studied this next generation, post COVID and where we are right now? Are there anything that you're surprised that has evolved from when you first started to where it is right now?
I think the thing that I'm most stunned at is issues around gender fluidity.
Hmm.
That happened very quickly, that became a national conversation. And while I think that all adolescents kind of go through life asking a lot of the same questions, the options they've had to respond to them have been more. And so, like I remember when my daughter came out to me as a heterosexual. She
Hmm.
came, I'll let that sink in for a second. She came into the bedroom and said, "Hey, mom and dad, I just want you to know I'm straight. I'm not gay. I like boys."
Hmm.
And I was like, "Okay, thank you." And she left, and I leaned over to my wife and I go, "Do we need to have a follow-up conversation with her? Like, what's going on there?" So I went up and I said, "Hey, Sky, I think what you just shared with me is really important to you, and you've obviously given it a lot of thought. I'm just curious, did you think that we thought something differently of you, or, why did you feel you needed to let us know this?" And she just said, "Well, all my friends are trying to figure out what they are. And I've been thinking about it, and I like boys, so I'm straight."
Hmm.
And I realized, like, wow, never before for older generations did you consciously think about it,
Hmm.
unless
Yeah.
you were a sexual minority, and you were realizing I don't fit the norms that everybody else is following. But consciously, you didn't think about, am I a boy? Am I a girl? Am I gay? Am I straight? Am I L, the G, the B, the T, the Q? And so I think some of those things have really changed because the internet has provided, and beyond sexuality, the internet has provided just thousands upon thousands of options for a younger generation to choose from. And I think that that's overwhelmed them and create a lot of anxiety for them in the world. So everybody says, well, Gen Z is a digital generation. And I'm like, yes, but what has that created?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
it's allowed them to learn things. It's allowed them to connect with others globally. It's allowed them to be more homogenized as a global generation. So there's a lot of really powerful things, I think, with Gen Z that are really important. I'm really interested in understanding these things because Urbana is going to be for this next generation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this will be the first all Gen Z Urbana that
Yeah.
InterVarsity has done. And so really understanding the world that they're in and what God is asking of them is really critical.
Yeah. Mark, even this whole idea of how they view the church as well, too. Not only the Gen Z, but all of the generations. And I
Yeah.
learned this from reading a Barna report, is that a lot of these guys are walking away from the traditional church. It's not that they're giving up a religion. You would think they're agnostic or they're atheists. No, it's not like that. They still are praying. They're still reading scripture. They still say they're Christ followers.
Hmm.
They just don't like the organized institutional church.
Yeah, we're seeing that quite a bit. And we're seeing it, in the last wave of research we did, we're seeing this really strong growth among of this habit with women and younger
Mm-hmm.
women. And that's been something where people said, well, we expect boys to act like this. They're not going to get into church and all, but now females are feeling the same way. And
Oh,
so we're seeing a huge increase in the number of disaffiliated persons that are females. And so that's a trend that's important for us to be watching and to try to understand. And some of that even feeds into this new book that we did, Faith for the Curious,
yeah.
because it kind of raises some questions and also provides maybe some insights into why this younger generation is not feeling like the church is the place for them to grow in their faith.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful segment for us to talk about your newest book, Faith for the Curious. give us a preview. What are those symptoms? Why are they falling away? Why are they struggling with the institutionalized church?
Well, one of the interesting things that we found is what we actually did is we measured the curiosity levels of Americans. And we looked at those inside the church and those outside the church. And then we kind of like uh, indexed that with their belief in the supernatural world. And what we found was this group of people that we call the spiritually curious that have high levels of curiosity, but they're also very open to the fact that there is a spiritual realm out there. And what was interesting, though, is we looked at this. One of the scales that we used was a need for closure scale. And those inside the church have a much higher need for closure than those that are spiritually curious. And so there's nothing wrong inherently with having a high need for closure. It's just a cognitive style. If but a high need for closure means that I don't like ambiguity, I don't like questions. I'm seeking information more for certainty than for wonder and curiosity and
Oh,
imagination. So if we have a church that might be, and this is, I'm theorizing here and interpreting the data, but if we have a church that has a culture that's all about certainty and about closure, if I'm asking questions about the faith, I'm probably going to be given very simple answers that are thought out and most likely true, but unsatisfying. And so I may want to, find after a while that the church is not a safe place for me to ask these questions, or not a place that I can have these questions answered. One of the qualities that we found in the spiritually curious is what I call the DIY spirit, the do it yourself spirit. It's not about them choosing and picking what they want their faith to look like, but it's about them having agency to actually be involved in its construction. And in our churches as pastors, what we're used to doing is going, studying all these books, doing all this homework, and then coming and presenting it to our congregants. But in an age of curiosity and spiritual openness and digital, with the digital, world available to us, people are much more used to going and piecing things together for themselves. And so they don't want all of our conclusions. They'd actually rather watch us construct our sermons and be a part of that journey than they would just like to hear the end result. And so
hmm.
that's a real important part, is that a lot of times our churches haven't been designed
No.
to
Mm-mm.
cater to those people. It's more
Yeah.
like a museum than it is a book. You go
Yes.
in and
Uh
you
huh.
choose what you want to look at. There's some curation that's happened, right? It's not, there's not just anything up on the wall. There's a reason why it's there and something else isn't. But you can read the little plaque. You can ignore a painting that it's not interesting to you. You can use a QR code and listen to audio. There might be a docent nearby that you could ask questions of. And so you have a lot more agency. And I think in this post-truth culture, where people have to kind of like vet what I'm going to believe or not, and not just take it on somebody's authority that this is accurate, we have to think about how we're letting people experience Christianity and their search for spiritual meaning in
Yeah.
their lives.
So, putting your consultant hat on,
Yeah.
does the church, will new church start evolving, or how do churches make adjustments to engage these people?
Well, I think churches can adjust. There's no question that. And we have to remember that a lot of people are coming to church because they find peace there. It is sanctuary for them.
Yeah.
If they're living in a world that's throwing questions at them all the time, sometimes going to church is what gives them rest. But that may not be appealing to those outside of the church. So it's almost like we might need a halfway house, something before they come into the walls of the church that allows for them to explore, to have this curiosity, whatnot. But there's some really cool people experimenting with new things. A friend of mine, Aaron Berkey, who's a pastor in Manhattan, he he started noticing that all of these executives were coming out of these meditation studios in Manhattan. So he kind of did a tour of them. I talk about this in Faith of the Curious. He
Hmm.
did a tour of them, started finding some things that people were looking for there, and he designed a church experience called The Well, that was a church that was centered on wellness and mindfulness, all
Mm.
biblical concepts. And He brought everything in through an evangelical theology, and even created a worship form using lo-fi beats that were very similar to what these studios were using to bring calmness into people's lives. And so he created a whole new church form based on where people were looking for spirituality. And that's another interesting thing that we found in the research. Um, a lot of times when we're taught evangelism, we're told people have like a hole in their soul. And so they're walking around looking to fill their hole with something. And that's not completely, inaccurate, obviously. It's St. Augustine, but there's a different way of looking at it, because it's not that people are looking to fill this existential emptiness as much as they're looking for an upgrade to what they're already experiencing that's good in their life. So maybe they're pursuing justice. Maybe they're pursuing creativity. Maybe they're pursuing intimacy and community. Maybe they're searching for ways to be more compassionate or to serve and be involved in helping other people. What it is it's the broken image of God inside of them, like a little mirror that's been busted up to pieces, and this little piece of mirror is still shining the glory of God in their life, and they're going, I like that. I like that. How do I make that bigger? And it's not so much that it's a vacuum, a hole, as much as it is space that wants to grow and be filled with this little shard of something that's there. And so when I'm interacting with people that are outside the church, I'm always trying to look for, where is the image of God showing up in their life right now? Because they're probably trying to make that bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is the only one who's going to help them make that bigger in their life. They're never going to be as compassionate as they could be without Jesus. They're never going to experience justice like they could without Jesus. They're never going to be as creative as they could be without Jesus. And so I want them to, I want to find that. And I find that's a great starting point for the spiritually curious, is finding that common thing in God's image that we can connect on, and then talk about how that can be bigger and bigger in their life.
Yeah. But Mark, you mentioned a lot of times pastors aren't taught to think that way. They're not taught to engage their way. They're taught to be on there on Sunday service. Everyone takes out their notebooks. You listen to me. How does then the role of the pastor change in caring for some of these guys?
Well, I unfortunately, especially in North America, I was just listening to Sam George talk out at a gathering at Wheaton, and he was
Mm-hmm.
talking about what are the contributions that North America has made to Christianity while it, kind of was centered here for a while. And one of the things he talked about was celebrity culture.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that we've created, pastors that have brands and all this stuff, and some really gifted teachers, but it's turned into something that was never meant to be. And I think that there is a need for us to kind of go back and go, what does it mean for a pastor to be a shepherd, to
Mm-hmm.
really be the pastor and the caretaker, a cultivator of people's lives? And I'm not saying that to be critical of pastors. Being
Yeah.
a pastor today is really hard work, but I think it came out a lot in the pandemic, where a lot of my friends who are pastors were like, it's really hard to get up and speak to a camera or to speak to an empty room. And so I said, well, is that the most important thing that you should be doing? And when I would ask people when they went to church online instead of church in person, what did you not get today that you normally get when you go to church? And people had a really hard time answering that. And I think that is something for us. People would answer with a question mark, like hugs, fellowship. There was kind of like a little at the end of their responses. They're trying to think through that. And if I'm not vital as a member of the body of Christ in my church activity, I'm probably not going to feel like I need to show up on Sundays. And I think that's what the pandemic has maybe given us an opportunity to see in our churches is, wait a minute, what are we not doing that we could be doing or that we should be
Mm.
doing?
Yeah. Mark, in your experience, I know you've worked with movement.org. Now you're working with Urbana, all your stuff working with Barna and all that stuff, and now with your book, specifically with marketplace leaders.
Yeah.
Are you seeing a particular niche with marketplace leaders that's changing in the last couple of years?
What I'm seeing a lot of are marketplace leaders who are no longer satisfied with just writing their checks
Hmm.
to people who are doing ministry. They actually are becoming co-creators and collaborators around things that they're passionate in.
Hmm.
And I think that's been a really, for the most part, a positive thing. I think there is something about people who are trained and dedicated in doing ministry work that shouldn't be undervalued. But it's really powerful when you have somebody who's saying, "Hey, I'm giving of my own wealth to this project, and it's my own generosity that's driving this, and now I'm pulling other ministers into inform it, speak, whatever, um but I want you to join me in this because I'm giving to it." And I'm seeing a lot of that, kind of kingdom approach to collaboration. And I've seen, gosh, I think I've personally been involved in 5 or 6 of these experiences where business leaders are the driver
Yeah,
of what's happening.
yeah,
And I think that's been pretty exciting. A lot of them, as they're going into their halftime moment, or they've reached a place of financial security that they don't have to work every day, and they're going, okay, how do I use this capacity? And I'm
yeah,
kind of excited about that.
yeah.
I think it's a new era.
Oh my gosh, Mark, it feels like a lot of times when I was younger, it was work really hard because that's just what you have to do. And then on Sundays, you serve in the local church wherever there's a need. Children's ministry, if you're really spiritual, you're going to be an elder or a deacon of a church. And then you give to the church. And that was it. And now the narrative is, how has God designed you? How has God called you to do? How do you fit within the gospel ecosystem in which your city's at? And now more like what you just said, more than just writing a check, more than just making a donation, they want to be involved in what's happening.
Yeah, because they have more to offer. And I think this is, to be honest, this is one of my big takeaways just from charity in general, and maybe the way that we in the West have operated globally, is that we gave without needing anything back. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, 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 yeah.
and to me, real love depends on the other person. And so if I'm just giving away something, but I don't really, if there's nothing that I'm receiving back from this other person, it doesn't have to be equitable. It doesn't have to be, in kind, but um, then there really isn't the basis of love there. It really is a condescending, or it's a cold charity. And I think that a lot of business leaders got to a point where they were saying, I want to feel more connected to this.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not just writing my check to you so that I can feel good about the work that I'm doing. And I think a lot of business leaders are also learning how to redeem work. um, I think this is really exciting too, where it's like I'm not just seeing what I do as a way to make money and give it to ministries, but how does the actual work that I'm doing, how does it also become the way that I am the hands and feet of Jesus? In fact, I talk about this in Faith of the Curious, but there's a game that I used to play when I would get on the airplane. I still do it every now and then, but when somebody would tell me what they do or what their business is, I would go, "Oh, you must be a Christian." And this was such a surprising response to people that then they would go, "Why would you say that?" And then I would have to connect what they did with the kingdom, and
Mm.
and kind of what God's plan is for man. And it was fascinating, some of the stories that I would get into. This guy was a corrugated engineer. He designed cardboard boxes. And and so I said that to him. "Oh, you must be a Christian." He goes, "Why would you say that?" And I go, "Well, I could just see, your whole thing is about trying to, use as little material as possible so that you preserve nature and all." And he was like, "I've never thought about it that way." And you could see people change just as they started realizing what I do is really making a difference in the
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
And they don't
yeah.
even recognize it sometimes. And then to think, how could I do that more and more and more? Is this really, really fun? I had a guy, he goes, "Okay, I got one for you." I did this in a church one time. He goes, "Okay, I got one for you. I'm an I sell asphalt. And you'd be like, blacktop, like pavement? He goes, yeah. And I said, okay. So, you know, think about what you're doing is you are literally um, putting, helping us live on earth as it is in heaven. Because in heaven, there will be no potholes. There will be no, everything will be smooth and whatever. And I go, you're changing. And he was just like, as I was talking to him, I could just see his brain lighting up and, giving meaning to work for people. The gospel does that. And I think I'm seeing that a lot happening too, is that people are really just looking at what they do is I'm not just generating money, but how do I make this place the best first job that a young person ever has? How do I help set a person up for a powerful life and an intimacy in their marriages? There are ways to think about the work that we're doing that are transformative in and of themselves.
Very, very good. No, love that conversation. Bob, I mean, not Bob, Mark, we're running out of time here. So I know a lot of times Bob Dollo actually is going to come and he's our guest
Yeah,
host. He'll probably
yeah,
interview you on this book here. Let me ask you a couple of really fast questions as we're wrapping up our time
sure.
here. Number one is, eh, for even as you think through Urbana and all the topics you're wrestling through, what
hmm
are you hoping that these students will get from this next Urbana coming up in 2025?
Well, I think those of us who are older and older generations, we always think, I've got to take what I know about a generation and solve the problem for them rather than just introducing the situation to them and letting God lead them to the solutions that their generation will bring. And what I'm really trying to do at Urbana is really just say, here's where God is moving in the world right now. And here's what the world looks like. And I'm really trusting God to work in their hearts and minds and to inspire their imagination about how they'll respond to him and be a part of the Great Commission.
Yeah.
God has a missionary heart. And when we emulate that in our own lives, whatever that looks like, we are mirroring, the image of God in our own lives. And I think this generation has an incredible imagination. They're living in a world that none of us have ever lived in natively, and I think um, I'm really believing that God's going to do some powerful things at Urbana. I always say I can't make something happen, but using my California theology, but I can wax my board and get in position so that when the wave comes, I can ride it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
believe that there is a wave coming for North American young people, and I want to wax the board and get in position to ride it when it comes.
Speaking of the wave, are those same questions that they asked in Toronto still relevant to Urbana today?
Yes, I think that those same three questions are relevant, and that's what we're going to be focusing on in the program. We want to give students the opportunity to hear what God is doing around the world. We want them to hear from God's word. We're going to be studying the book of Jonah while we're together at Urbana, and then giving them time to reflect and pray, meet with coaches and guides, um, different agencies that will be there for service opportunities to just discern. So, God, what do you want me to do as a result? And
Yeah.
we're expecting God to show up as He has for since 1946.
Yeah. Why the move to Phoenix, Arizona?
You know, we wanted to go west and warm.
Yes.
No, there wasn't a ton of strategy around
Yeah.
it. It just so happened that as I took leadership, the location wasn't nailed down. So I thought, why don't we see if there are any other cities interested in hosting
Yeah.
Urbana? And we had four really great cities that loved us, really wanted us to be there. And for some reason, we felt that Phoenix was the right one. And then come to find out that the missions community in Phoenix had actually been praying that God would make Phoenix a sending city to the world.
Mm.
And when I learned this, that there were all of these people gathering in Phoenix, praying every week for the Great Commission and Phoenix role in it, I realized there may be a reason that God called Urbana to be in Phoenix. It had nothing to do with us, but had to do with the prayers of these pastors and mission agencies.
Very good. One last question. In writing your book, was there something that surprised you that you never even thought of as you were researching and looking at the book?
Wow, that's a great question. The whole thing was a bit of a surprise. You start with the hypothesis. I think what surprised me was as I was looking at other research that we were doing for different groups, I started noticing that there were about 80 million Americans. Turns out there's quite a bit more, but that didn't fit some of the paradigms that we had when we think about people outside of the church. And that was what I wanted the research to find out was, are we missing people or not connecting with them? So the big surprises were, one, the majority of Americans want to grow spiritually, not necessarily in Christianity, but they want to grow spiritually, and Christianity is the best way to do that. So there's that. And then the people that really are hardcore, I don't believe that God exists, they're actually a pretty small group of people, less than 10% of the U.S. population. The majority of Americans believe there is something more out there.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of them feel it more certainly than others. And so just sitting down and talking with somebody, there's a pretty good chance that they believe something about what happens after we die, what happens in the supernatural world, and that if we are less aggressive in sharing with people and we are more curious calls to curious. If we're more curious about what other people believe, they will in turn be more curious about what we believe, and we'll have an opportunity. So I don't need to be afraid about having spiritual conversations. People actually would like to have them with people that will respect them and not
Yeah,
force a conclusion.
very good. Mark, where can people find out more information about you, your book, or even Urbana?
Urbana.org. That's the place to get information on all things Urbana. Faithforthecurious.com is where you can check out information on the book. It's available wherever you buy books. But if you go to faithforthecurious.com, there's a way to order them in bulk for a discount. And there's some sample chapters and other things you can get. So I encourage you to check that out. And but as for me, just LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, I'm in all those places.
Yeah. Mark, thank you very much. We're going to talk soon here in January.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it, Tommy.
All right. Talk soon, Mark.
Yeah, you bet.